Hi, the following content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. If you are a healthcare provider, please consult with your affiliated institution or local ethics committee for ethical guidance related to clinical practice.
This is BioE 131, Module 32, the second part of genetic engineering. David.
Okay, so now last time we talked about utilitarianism and the way it would look at genetic engineering. Now we want to move beyond utilitarianism to look at non-consequential considerations or deontological considerations. And there's a big literature on these kinds of concerns. So one set of concern is sometimes referenced as the wisdom of repugnance. Some of these concerns both do and do not play a role in the Autumn Feaster article that you read for today. So there's also a discussion of them in the article that Art Kaplan and I wrote that you also read for today. But anyway, the wisdom of repugnance, playing God is another related concept. And sometimes people talk about something being unnatural and seeming problematic just by virtue of it being unnatural. There are a lot of possible quotes to support for these kinds of views that are in the literature from people who are opponents. I'm just going to give one from Donald Bruce from the Church of Scotland's book that he co-wrote with his wife on it's been called Engineering Genesis. There is a wisdom in the natural order of things which reflects the goodness and purposiveness of the Creator. For humans to mix aspects of different organisms by genetic engineering would go beyond God's wise ordering of life. So this is sort of that idea of the wisdom of repugnance, and that there's an ordering to things, and that it's presumptuous to try and change those things.
So the idea is, if you feel in your gut that something is repugnant, you should not ignore it. There might be something there that can be drawn out of ethical importance.
Yeah, and there's different views about the significance of this. The term wisdom of repugnance comes from Leon Kass, who was the former head of Bush's president's ethics advisory committee. For Leon Kass, he thinks the wisdom of repugnance is very significant and carries a tremendous amount of moral weight, even if you cannot articulate an ethical reasoning to justify it on the grounds that there may be things that are hard to articulate sufficiently, but that in our gut we know are just wrong. But I'm going to make some arguments about some of the problems with this, and I actually published a piece and a debate with Dan Callahan about wisdom of repugnance in relation to GE. So just an example, back when Benjamin Franklin developed the technology for a new high-end tech at the time, namely the lightning rod. The lightning rod was seen as playing God. Only God should determine where lightning strikes. This was presumptuous and a terrible thing. Nobody would say lightning rods are a terrible thing today. So that's an example of something that just seems strange and new, and that people got used to. And that's happened a lot in these technologies. Leon Kass, who coined the wisdom of repugnance, thought the idea of in vitro fertilization or test tube babies, quote unquote, was repugnant and a terrible thing. It's not clear that he doesn't still think that, but over time, people just stopped. That argument stopped having much weight. There's also always the risk that repugnance can be a function of prejudice. If you went back in time, there are a lot of things that people would have found just repugnant, like people from different races dating and intermarrying. That's nothing but prejudice as opposed to any kind of wisdom. And in general, it can often be fear of the new, fear of the unfamiliar. And so, while while repugnance is a morally significant response and worthy of interrogation to explore whether there really is something behind it, I think we need to really figure out whether or not there's justification for it, rather than just say that having that response is sufficient by itself. Now, when it comes to playing God, we did an analysis, and we talk about this a bit in the paper that book chapter that you read from us for today, which is something that was based on a focus group of people from different religious traditions that we brought together, and what playing God really means. We found a number of different things, and I do want to emphasize how important this kind of response is politically, as well as, and emotionally, as well as ethically. When opponents of genetic engineering took out full-page ads in the New York Times, they did not say, unsafe food or environmentally bad impact. they took out an ad that said "playing God" and had that image of that well-known image, very misleading image of the mouse with the looks like a human ear on its back. And so that idea that this repugnance and that playing God is a big concern, but it's important to cash this very vague, inchoate concern out in order for it to be really have any substance. So we identified a number of things that were embedded when people had those kinds of concerns and raised them in practice. Some worried about transgressing the integrity of species, and that there's something inviolate about the integrity of species. We found that to be the weakest argument, but it is one that some people do sometimes make. It's hard to justify that if you believe in evolution, but that is one of the arguments. But other arguments include worries about hubris and that science, especially corporate science, is arrogant. And I will just say, with all due respect to all of my brilliant scientific colleagues, Russ and I have a lot of colleagues at Stanford who are very successful and very smart. I would not say they're very humble. I would not say humility is a very, very popular virtue among the scientific elite.
And it is not positively selected for in the academic system.
And I think that's equally true of corporate science. It's not a lot of humility, and so the worry is that that this hubris that people have may lead to unintended, negative, very bad consequences, and represent something that's very problematic. There are also worries about notions of ownership of life and whether or not there's something improper about kind of patenting of living organisms, and whether or not there's a certain kind of commodification of life and whether that's problematic. And then there are also some of the discussion of playing God references notions of stewardship and actually biblically, in the Christian tradition, biblically based notions of stewardship and duty to the world. That existed. So those are all different senses of playing God that we identified. Now, some of these kinds of concerns are, I think, reflected in Autumn Feaster's notion of a presumption of restraint, is how she puts it. But I just want to capture this glowfish, these glow-in-the-dark fish that are genetically engineered, are actually banned, or at least they were banned in California by the Department of Fish and Game. And the Department of Fish and Game, 3 of the commissioners wrote an op-ed in the San Francisco Chronicle back in 2003 when they explained why this product that was commonly available everywhere else in the country was going to be banned. And they didn't say that they were terribly worried about the risks of having these pet glowfish. What they said was, why are they opposed to this? For the 3 of us who voted no, it was a decision based on values. Moving a gene from one species to an entirely different species is an awesome display of human ingenuity and power over nature and should not be done for trivial purposes. No matter how low the risk is, there needs to be a public benefit that is higher than this. So I think this captures that this is not about risk versus benefits for them. It's that if we're going to exhibit the power of changing the nature of organisms and taking genes from one species and putting them into the other, this playing God concern is really saying if we're going to do that power, we should do so with humility and only in cases where there's really a very strong rationale that it will help people rather than for trivial reasons.
Although that does interact with your previous arguments about as things change, new things seem to be like trivial, like this use of the language like awesome display of ingenuity. It's awesome today, but in 10 years when we're doing it in high school labs, it might not be awesome anymore.
I think that's very true. And I think that's an important thing to always remember in this. People might have said that, but I still think the trivial nature of what was being pursued there still carried some weight. But but I think the more people are used to it, the easier it is to create a rationale that would justify the technology.
If I can interrupt to tell a short, relevant story. Hank Greeley, who you know very well, he's a law professor, was at a Department of Genetics retreat. And he said, he was talking about this move to take the DNA of woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and try to grow back a woolly mammoth or a saber-toothed tiger, which the reason I'm mentioning is you could consider that a trivial thing. So he asked this room of geneticists, he said, who thinks there are significant ethical, social issues with bringing back woolly mammoths and Siberian tigers? And we all, almost everybody in the room raised their hand. And then he said, who would go to the zoo filled with such animals? And everybody raised their hand, and it kind of just demonstrated that we can be of two minds. Different parts of our brains are almost making those decisions.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, but one big question is, what's the scientific value of that?
Right.
Is it if it's important scientifically? Some people have claimed that autumn is too quick to not recognize that even for the glowfish, that the glowfish were a byproduct of real science that was valuable, and the same for the rabbit that was glow in the dark, and that this was just once they had them, then they might as well commercialize them. So when we sort of tried to work through this, we identified some critical value, non-consequentialist, non-utilitarian values to think about when assessing technology that captures some of the things in the playing God objection, but not all of them, because some of them, as Russ just mentioned, maybe it's just unfamiliar with the new. One is justice. So justice matters, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Another might be consumer sovereignty, especially this matters for when you think about food, which is the place of food in our culture and in our society is so important. Nowhere is that clearer now when we cannot go out to restaurants and cannot break bread with each other in the way that we used to. It's unbelievably important to us. There's reasons why there are food rules and laws and aspects of food that are present in every religious tradition. Food is really an important part of our society and our culture and our values. And so the ability that people would have a right to choose important things that matter to them in their food. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. Maybe the boundary transgressions. Maybe boundary transgressions, maybe those matter, maybe not. I would also add authenticity. I've actually done some work for the wine industry because of my GMO work. And it's interesting to think about issues about other kinds of ways in which value matter. I mean, you just mentioned that zoo idea. Who would go to a museum full of nothing but replicas? Like, I can't tell the difference between an original Rembrandt and a good copy, or a good Renoir and a good copy. But it would be very easy to build a lot of museums full of great copies of all the great art, and yet we don't do that, and that's because people wouldn't go to them. Now, could I tell the difference? The physical thing would look the same. The light striking the painting and hitting my eye would be very similar. But no, but it was the origins of it, the authenticity, the story behind it. All of those things actually matter to making it real. It turns out in a lot of aspects of food, culture, and wine, there are issues about what makes something real. In the same way, if you could, what the origins are matters for those kinds of things. So there's a metaphysics of food and a metaphysics of wine that actually are non-consequential values. And actually some of the same things arise in the issue of GE forests and the notion of wilderness, and what does it mean to have a wilderness and have wilderness actually exist? And is that undermined? Even if you could have very similar trees, having them genetically engineered might undermine something that's of aesthetic value and matters to us. So that's enough probably on authenticity. I've actually done some work on that topic as well, but let's talk about justice in a little bit more detail. So there, the issue is who gets exposed to risks versus who benefits. So it's not just about do the risks outweigh the benefits, it's about who's exposed. If you have one group that has all the power exposing another group to risks for their benefit and not for the benefit of the people who are exposed to the risks, that is a real problem. Who gets to make decisions? Who has control over the decisions about the technology? Is the regulatory system set up in a way to be fair? Is the intellectual property system set up in a way to be fair? As I said, I've written a little bit about that and edited a volume called Who Owns Life about some of these issues. But those are all examples of non-consequential values. To show you how much of a grip utilitarianism has, I was on the National Academy of Science Committee on bioconfinement of genetically engineered organisms. And when I was writing some of the ethics chapters, I talked about some of these non-consequential values, and that issues of justice mean it doesn't just matter what the risks versus benefits are, it matters what their distribution is. And the response by the reviewer from the NAS was, no, all that matters is risks versus benefits weighing out. It doesn't matter how they're distributed.
They did not take this class.
They did not read anything other. They stopped at Mill. they did not read Kant.
This might be the time to tell them about our app idea.
Oh, Russ.
For those of you who have made it to the end of the module, here's an idea that David and I had for a business.
Well, it's your idea.
I like how you tell it.
Well, Russ has the idea of how that we should make an ethics app that would be like ethics, and we'd have a free version and a pay version. The free version is utilitarianism, and you have to pay to get deontological reasoning.
That would be Ethics Pro. It includes Kantian and deontological reasoning.
Yeah.
So anybody who wants to build that, send us a message. We can think about it. Okay. Sorry.
So, anyway. So Marion Nessel, who is a former regulator who's written a lot about GMO and about food generally, has a nice discussion in her book Safe Food about the difference between how science versus science assessment of risks versus a value-based risk assessment. And you can see the things that matter beyond just the immediate risks and benefits. For example, if you're thinking about this again in utilitarian terms, it's just about how many cases do you have, what's the severity, what are the harms, how many hospitalizations, what are the costs, etc. And you're balancing risks against benefit and costs. But when you actually think about what people really care about, and there's a lot of social science behind this, they care about risk in other dimensions, like whether or not it's voluntary imposed or imposed, and they look at risk differently, whether they're voluntary imposed, whether they're visible or hidden, whether they're understood or uncertain, whether they're familiar or foreign, natural or technological, controllable or uncontrollable, fairly or unfairly distributed. And there, what you're really balancing are risks not against benefit and cost, but against dread and outrage. So those are all moral ways of thinking about these things that are not captured by these consequentialist frameworks.
Well, wouldn't a consequentialist say that as long as you can give me some numbers to quantify dread and outrage, we can throw it into the calculation?
Yeah, but it won't really work because those things can't be measured in the same way. And when you're really thinking about the risks and benefits, those other dimensions, which maybe when I talk to economists about this idea and really talk about non-consequentialist values, they try and say, well, either I can put a number on it or it's just, I understand that there's a rationality. And they just think of it as being
irrational. There's two bins in their heads: rational and quantifiable and irrational. So what we just listed for the non-utilitarian is a bunch of what they would say irrational considerations.
Correct, irrational considerations. I want to return briefly to justice and intellectual property. I'll just say, I'm not going to say a lot about this as when we think about justice and unfairness as a value in the system, but the way in which the intellectual property system has been developed, and there's a big literature about this, has really been designed in such a way as to really benefit institutions and players who have deep pockets. There's a very low bar. The way our patent system works, there's a very, very low par for patents. Our Patent and Trademark Office's view is that it's not their job to determine whether the patents are really valid. That's for the courts to decide when they determine whether they're enforceable. And so they have a very low bar for being able to be patented. And then it's really up to litigation to make those decisions. But since litigation is so expensive, it means that people can make land grabs in different kinds of ways to intellectual property. In addition, there's a sense in which hard-won, especially indigenous knowledge or germplasm that's been preserved in other countries winds up being exploited and utilized, which can be a problem. And so these are all different ways in which the system can be quite exploitative. And people who are interested in more about that, I can point you towards some readings, including a paper I've written about that. I want to end with one last topic, which is this issue which I mentioned earlier about consumer sovereignty. Food, we've already seen, is really, really important. We've also already seen that even if the food is safe, there could be reasons why people might not want to eat GMOs, either because they're worried about, say, the environmental impacts of them, or if they're not, or because they have religious concerns about them. They might be worried about kashrut if you're Jewish, or they might be worried about haram versus halal if you're a Muslim. There are all kinds, if you're Catholic, you might be worried about what eating meat at certain times of the year. There are all kinds of prohibitions that might be on religious grounds for concerning about food, or you might think some of those playing God objections or some of the other non-consequential considerations about justice really matter, and that leads somebody to say that I want to opt out of the system. But it's not that easy to do. And so there are issues around food labeling. If you think there are reasons why some people might prefer not to eat genetically engineered foods, then they ought to have the ability to do so. There has been a move around labeling because a lot of states started to pass laws, labeling laws. The industry lobbied, and there's now laws to create a bioengineering BE label on GMOs, but it's not applied to all GMOs. And so that's one area of concern that people have about whether or not the current system is adequate for exercising true consumer sovereignty. I'm
They
going to
have
tell
come
you.
up with definitions of organic, though, that are pretty much accepted. Is that true?
Correct. Organic is well defined in terms of labeling, as long as it's USDA organic. And that actually matters. So I'm going to tell you how to tell if your food is, at least some of your foods have GMO in them or not, or have GE in them. If they're USDA organic, and they say USDA organic, then they're not, and they're a processed food or an unprocessed food, they are not genetically engineered. So that's that one thing to know. Anything that's organic equals no GMO. If it says non-GMO and it's verified by a trusted NGO, then the degree to which you can have confidence in it depends on the degree of confidence you have in this non-regulatory NGO body. So there's something called GMO Project Verified. If you trust that entity, which seems like a pretty trustworthy outfit, then you should trust it. But you really have to make a decision about whether you trust it, because that's not governmental. All of those are true for whole foods, for processed foods. So for processed foods, if it's not, doesn't say GMO free from somebody you trust, or it doesn't say USDA organic, then you should assume that there's GMO in it. For whole foods like oranges or papayas and things like that, it's a little trickier. Again, you could use those same things. Some have labels saying GMO free. There are some that are USDA organic, but it's not, there aren't that many, unlike processed foods, where if it doesn't have the label, it all has GMO because it's everywhere. That's not true for whole foods as much. So you can't tell whether it is there or if it isn't there as well without really following the literature. So for example, if you buy a non-organic papaya from Hawaii that doesn't say specifically that it's non-GMO, then probably it's GMO because the Hawaiian industry was virtually wiped out and GM saved it. A version of BT saved the industry in Hawaii. But if you buy it from Mexico or Brazil and the same thing, it probably is not GM. And so you really just have to follow sort of what's commercialized. And a lot of people are hopeful that these new BE labels will help for at least those whole foods so that you could at least meet the requirements of consumer sovereignty. And Paul Thompson has written some good work on this, including a whole lovely, really good book about food biotechnology. So that's it. I just would want to add that one thing that makes me sad about this module is that, and this topic that we're covering today, is in past years, we've actually brought out examples of food to everybody and shown them the labels and seen who could figure out what was GM and what wasn't. And people were not very good at figuring it out. Most people did not know that organics did not have GM, and people didn't know that there might be cloned meat in their beef jerky or in the meat supply when they buy meat, was something that was news to a lot of people, which just shows that as important as food is to us, on the whole, people don't know very much about it. And it is possible to learn more, but we definitely need more transparency in the food industries, I think. Okay, that's it for this video.
I also made the point that this was the lecture that in previous years you brought a bunch of food to class and distributed it as you discussed the ethical implications, and we are unable to do that this year. So we
Yes. Although I will say I cover this topic in my hum bio class, and last quarter for the first time I really popped somebody really good when I was throwing a box of something out to the class. So I'm a little scared next time. We're gonna have to be
there are
careful.
risks.
Yeah, there are risks.
Okay, well, this ends the module. Thank you very much.